If you remember, what we were talking about last time was this puzzles about money and finance, and we'd ended with this widget puzzle. Obviously we'd set up this scenario, which I've just put on the board to refresh your memory. And that made certain special assumptions about what the level of interest was. It made certain special assumptions about the timing of production. It made assumptions about what the propensity to save is, or the propensity to consume is, of different groups. And so those are all special cases designed to make a numerical point. What was the overall point, though, which would survive after, if you changed all the assumptions and if you did other things? Well, the point is simply this, is that if we are to have monetary profits, and we're asserting that the capitalist economy requires there to be profits in money terms, then to use the expression we said yesterday, M prime must be greater than M. What is the only way for M prime to be greater than M in the credit economy? It's that there should be bank credit creation. And the reason behind that is simple. All that money is are the deposit, the liability side of bank balance sheets. On the asset side, the credit side, the loans and other investments, that's the credit side. So if there is to be a higher liabilities side, a greater amount of money, there has to be somewhere, somehow, from someone in the system, more borrowing to make that occur. And that would be true in every single case, regardless of the assumptions that you made. It would, Matthias Grasselli, the director of this institute, our host here, also came up with one case where there was no net borrowing between the members of the private sector. But even in his case, there has to be money to start with. And where did that money come from? Well, money is the liability side of the bank balance sheet. Ergo, on the other side of the bank balance sheet, there must be loans and credits. So that was the basic point. And, I think that just to sort of, again, refresh your memories about the issues that we were talking about there, I think what I would like to do, this is sort of like a set of questions. If you're at the end of a book or a textbook or something, you'd say you give a set of questions as to what you've read in the previous chapter, right, and a set of answers. And I think it would be useful to do that. And here are my questions. The first one is, would imposing reserve requirements on the commercial banks solve the potential problem? Obviously, reserve requirements is one of the types of bank regulation that is suggested on the asset side of the bank balance sheet. And so would imposing reserve requirements on commercial banks solve the potential problem? You can see that obviously, if we're to answer that question, we have to ask ourselves, what is the potential problem? The next question I ask, and this has to do with bank regulation on the liabilities side of the balance sheet, would imposing ex-ante capital requirements on the commercial banks, I'm thinking of the Basel I, Basel II, Basel III, and so forth, solve the potential problem? Again, obviously, in order to answer that question, we'd have to ask, what is the potential problem? The third question, and this did relate to our discussions about the alternative theories of value. Remember how we had some exchange about the neoclassical utility theory of value and the Marxian and classical labor theory of value, both in a certain sense real theories of value. We need to inquire what is the relation between the nominal profits that we've asserted are necessary and real profits, real depending on which value theory that you're employing. And then Fredrick did handle this one yesterday. Was our solution a permanent solution? Did it lead ultimately to a steady state solution? Our solution, if you remember, was simply more borrowing. Someone from the audience actually preempted us and said the solution is more borrowing. Yes, that was exactly that was exactly the point. But the question is, having solved the problem that way, is there a steady state equilibrium in the usual sense in this model? Is our solution a permanent solution? And what's the answer key to the question about reserves? No, reserves are not required. This was a Wickellian bank. It was the only bank in the system. They're not required. In any event, what would reserve requirements do? The reserve requirements that would attempt to reduce lending in some sense. And the problem is not enough lending. What about capital requirements, the other sort of type of bank regulation? Well, once again, our problem is not enough lending. So it's hardly the problem of trying to restrict the banks from making lending. In the specific example that we used, suppose the bank was burdened with a 12% capital requirement to begin with. Well, simply there was no capital, so the business wouldn't get off the ground, and there would be, that would be the case. Obviously, as the situation developed, the bank did accumulate capital in the accounting sense, but we noticed actually that as the situation developed, the bank actually became overcapitalized because the banks were dissipating none of their capital. They were just kind of piling up their bank capital, presumably in anticipation of someone coming and giving a stress test or whatever that they do. So the nominal versus real profits, well, that's indeterminate. It would depend precisely on one's view of the preferred theory of value. However, the point that we're making is that those money profits must exist before any of the real profits must exist. There must be money profits in order for anyone to gain utility. There must be money profits before, again, to use the Marxian expression, the labor theory is extracted, before surplus value is created. And that was the key point. I mean, obviously, in our model, nominal versus real is an indeterminate. The point is simply that we must have these money profits before we can start arguing about what the real profits are. Question 4, is it a steady state equilibrium? No, because as we pointed out, and Fredrick pointed out yesterday, the bank capital keeps piling up. And so eventually the system's going to wind down, like all the money eventually gets, locked up in bank capital. And in this particular example, again, I stress it's a particular example, to get a stable equilibrium with positive profits going on period after period, we would have to let the bank owners, so to speak, spend their capital also at the rate of 80% in this case. Now, in the AMM, which we looked at yesterday, we also have to solve the problem of the viability of the system. It's not solved in quite that way. We'll later in the class we'll show another way to solve the viability of the banking system, but the banking system must be viable. That's the point. And yesterday we shamelessly ripped off Koletsky, and we shall do the same thing again with Keynes. And this business of the bank capital piling up reminded me, anyway, of Keynes' Treatise on Money from 1930. Now, the interpolations are mine. I put in bank and financial. Keynes just talked about profits and capital income. So, this is my version of Keynes. Thus, bank profits as a source of capital increment for financial entrepreneurs are a widow's cruse, which remain undepleted, however much of them may be devoted to riotous living. So I think we're just going to leave that topic now. I just wanted to remind you of it because it underlies the rest of what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah.
Just for the
requirement, I guess it could have been supported with, because there is the case of, I guess, Canada and Australia, they don't have reserve requirements.
No, exactly, yeah.
It's a good example to show that reserve requirements really doesn't play.
Yeah. No, I mean, I agree with that. And of course, as we live here in Canada, we take that for granted as as an institutional thing. You're quite right. So our next topic obviously has to be alternative theories of the rate of interest. If we're talking about money and if we're talking about endogenous money, the next question is what happens to the rate of interest? And the first thing I want to point out is that if you like, the standard neoclassical or mainstream theory of the rate of interest is, well, I've called it the myth here. I've called it the myth of the natural rate of interest. These days, they don't use terms like natural rate of interest. In the Taylor rule, for example, they use terms the equilibrium interest rate, but it's the old Wickelsian natural rate writ large. So let's go right to the source and let's see how Wicksell defined this so-called natural rate of interest. And Wicksell defined it as follows: this natural rate is roughly the same thing as the real interest of actual business. A more accurate, though rather abstract criterion is obtained by thinking of it as the rate which would be determined by supply and demand if real capital, there's that phrase real capital again, what is real capital, were lent in kind without the intervention of money. It's quite explicit. It's an interest rate which exists without the intervention of money. Do you notice how this natural rate language pervades orthodox economics? There's a natural rate of interest, there's a natural rate of growth, there's a natural rate of unemployment, which was important in the days of the monetarist debates and so forth. And it's interesting that that's the bedrock, if you like, of the theory. Why is it a myth, though? Well, the obvious reason to me is that the definition Wicksell, in the definition, Wicksell invokes a hypothetical world without money, right? And yet which nonetheless has a fully fledged market economy, presumably by barter. We talked a lot about the different ontologies of the social world versus the natural world. And I'm going to argue that if we correctly understand by what is meant by such terms as money, credit, even a market, it is clear that the conditions that Wicksell talks about do not exist today, have never existed in the past, and I would assert, if we accept the kind of logical arguments that were made yesterday, cannot possibly exist in the future. And I'd just like to sum it up with the idea about how can there be actual business, like in the sense that you talk about business, like actual people buying and selling things for money, without there being a money of account, without there being credit creation, and so forth. So Keynes, of course, had a much more common sense definition of interest rate. And according to Keynes, it is nothing more than the inverse proportion between a sum of money and what can be obtained for parting with control over that money for a stated period of time. Yes, that's what you would have thought an interest rate is. And in the general theory, Keynes explicitly repudiated the notion of the natural rate of interest. In the Treatise on Money, the book which Hayek criticized, because Hayek was to some extent a Wickelsian as well, Keynes, writing about his own earlier Treatise on Money from 1930s, admits it was a mistake to speak of the natural rate, or to suggest it would yield a unique value for the rate of interest, irrespective of the level of employment. I am no longer of the opinion that the concept of the natural rate of interest has anything useful or significant to contribute to our analysis. So that's to Keynes' very great credit that he went out and explicitly made that rejection. So in reality, there is no natural rate of interest, and indeed we can extend that. In reality, there is no natural rate of growth, there is no natural rate of unemployment, nothing natural about any of those things. We're not actually dealing with natura. Nonetheless, and this is a point on which some heterodox monetary theorists, in my opinion, go astray a little bit. The concept of the real rate of interest is nonetheless important. Technically, the real rate of interest is simply the nominal interest rate less expected inflation. So in our notation, if the real rate of interest is R, the nominal rate of interest is I, P plus 1 obviously is the expected inflation rate next period. Lowercase p plus 1 is the expected inflation rate for the next period. According to Taylor, in the famous Taylor rule paper, his famous short paper about interest rate rules, we can often use the simple inflation-adjusted interest rate as a proxy for, in economist speak, proxy for means approximation to. An approximation to the real interest rate itself. That is, we could just take the currently observed inflation rate and say that the real interest rate is the nominal interest rate minus the currently observed inflation rate as a proxy or approximation to the real interest rate itself. However, contrary to Taylor and contrary to Wicksell, of course, going back, contrary to the whole of the new consensus of the late 90s through the early years of this century, the real rate of interest can take on any value. It is not tied down by a natural rate. Now, I teach, courses in, finance or courses in money and banking, that kind of thing. And interestingly enough, when you, pick up like a intermediate level textbook in these subjects, there's no discussion of real interest rates or natural interest rates or anything. You just get presented essentially theories of nominal interest rate determination. So the next topic I'm going to, the reason being is they want to avoid all these conundra that we've just been talking about. And so I now would like to mention three possible alternative theories of nominal interest rate determination. The first is the loanable funds theory, and that was the name originally given to the theory put forward by Dennis Robertson in the 1930s, and it remains the basic textbook theory of interest rates to this day. If you read Greenwald and Stiglitz's book of about 10 years ago, they argue that their theory of interest rates is an updated version, of loanable funds theory and so forth. And it is, in fact, the basic textbook theory of interest rates to this day in courses in finance and money and banking. Then there's the liquidity preference, which is associated with John Maynard Keynes, particularly in the General Theory, 1936, which depends upon the inverse relationship between the price of bonds and interest rates. An increase in liquidity preference, or in the treatise actually Keynes called it more expressively bearishness, nervousness in the financial markets, means an increase in the demand for money, a sell-off of bonds, a fall in the price of bonds, and an increase in the interest rate, and of course vice versa. And that's the liquidity preference theory. Now, a good many heterodox economists are, are committed to this liquidity preference theory, but Keynes did make a crucial error in the general theory, in that in the general theory, instead of having endogenous money, he had a fixed money supply, and that makes Keynes' particular version of liquidity preference theory problematical. The final one is what I'm going to call Post Keynesian horizontalism, and this name comes from Basil Moore's famous book in 1988, And the idea here is that as the central bank obviously does set the policy rate and usually accommodates the demand for reserves, this simply feeds through to interest rates in general. If you remember, we did have an equation whereby the policy rate of the central bank feeds through to interest rates in general. And I've repeated that equation there. So basically, the argument is that the supplies of credit and money both become infinitely elastic. And if we recall our interest rate equation relating the policy rate to the nominal rate, the argument, Basel's argument would be, is both money and credit supply become horizontal lines at this rate. And within the Post Keynesian school, as many of you know, there have been debates between structuralists and horizontalists as to which is right. I've just drawn 3 graphs which would hopefully illustrate the 3 theories. The loanable funds theory is just like a typical investment savings diagram, except it's all in nominal terms. We have nominal interest rates on one axis, we have the demand for loanable funds on the other axis, a supply of loanable funds, notice upward sloping on the other, and they determine the interest rate between them. In the liquidity preference, the idea is if there was an increase in bearishness, for example, that would tend to raise interest rates above this putative equilibrium level, shown by the black line across the page and the arrows moving upwards. And, Keynes' special theory, as Hicks called it, was that that's how interest rates get determined, not by demand and supply of loanable funds, but by liquidity preference. Now, as I pointed out, there is a problem with Keynes' actual exposition in the general theory, in that he repudiated the idea of a natural rate of interest, but at the same time assumed a fixed money supply, just like monetarists and just like neoclassical economists. And that immediately made him prey to the so-called real balance effect, which was immediately brought into play by neoclassical economists such as Pigou, Patinkin, and so forth. And the argument is simply that you won't be able to hold, like this panic won't be able to hold the interest rates at this high level for very long. What will happen is that if interest rates are high, there will be deflationary pressures. The money supply is fixed. If the money supply is fixed and the price level is falling, the real money supply is increasing, thereby satisfying any conceivable demand for liquidity you could possibly have. You get these stories about, similar to Dennis Robertson, that 1 penny could buy the whole GDP or something like that. And so the argument would be that the argument against Keynes was that actually it'll just boil down to the loanable funds theory again once you take into account the real balance effect. That result can be done away with entirely in the case of endogenous money. The horizontalism, again I put in, a downward sloping demand for loanable funds with respect to a nominal interest rate. I've kept in my hypothetical supply function, which would be there if the money supply was fixed. But of course, the essence of the horizontalist theory is that they simply lend at the given interest rate. I mean, the central bank lends at its policy rate. The other banks lend forever at their rate. And so effectively, the supply line of loanable funds in this case becomes horizontal. And, that would be the third story of interest rate determination. I mean, interestingly, if you think about it, what the Wicksell tried to do was try to sort of somehow take this as an institutional reality, at the same time still imagine there's a natural rate somewhere in the system, and make the two things differ in some sense. Can we derive our own theory of interest rates? And notice we would like to introduce these terms not just for nominal rates. We would like to introduce these same terms for real interest rates, we would like to keep the notion of endogenous money in this theory of interest rate determination. So I just want to remind you of the textbook theory of the demand for money, which was common to both Keynesians and monetarists during the debates of the mid-20th century. And that textbook theory was simply that the demand for real money balances depends positively on real income and negatively on the nominal interest rate I. And obviously, you've all seen this M over P is equal to the liquidity function, some liquidity function L, a function of Y and I. This introduces the demand for money as an asset, sometimes called speculative demand. And as I say, one thing that always used to confuse me, to be honest with you, as a student, was you had this great debate between Keynesians, so-called, that is to say, neoclassical Keynesians, and monetarists, so-called. And what was their theory? The same theory. So what's all the big fight about? Obviously, we have, at one point you must notice that standard textbook theory assumes that money is non-interest rate bearing. And that, of course, becomes a real problem if most of our money is bank deposits, because there is no reason at all why bank deposits should not bear an interest rate. So as I say, contrary to the textbooks, when we think of broad money in the modern credit economy, this is mostly bank deposits. And bank deposits are themselves, in principle, interest-bearing. Interest rates on them may be low at the moment, but if interest rates in general would be high, the interest rates on bank deposits would be higher. And so therefore, I think we must get back to something like this one, equation 8, which would be called the Marshallian cash balances approach, or the Cambridge K. The demand for real balances would be some fraction K of the total GDP. As I say, that is, it's a slightly different theory than the Fischerian velocity of circulation theory. It's a more coherent theory than that, actually, because it's talking about the demand for money sitting as opposed for money on the wing, as they used to say. Now, in our model, obviously we can't use the symbol K, as this means something else. We've already used it to mean the profit share. So I'd like to use Greek Y